Joel Blackledge is a Coventry University lecturer, filmmaker, writer, and pet dad to an adorable kitten named Remy. But today we're here to talk about his video essay series, Feast Your Eyes, which takes a critical look at some cult classics such as Jurassic Park, Candyman, Under the Skin, and more. Welcome to Coventry Limitless, Joel.
Thank you.
Pleasure to have you. Now, filmmaking, writing, please answer us. How on earth do you find the time?
Well, lockdown helps because a lot of that stuff you can do just when you're in a room by yourself with a laptop. And that's usually what I'm doing with my days these days because I can't go anywhere else.
Of course. Now, your video essay series, Feast Your Eyes, builds on your extensive film theory background to bring to life some elements of films that we take for granted. But what was your inspiration for starting the video essay series?
So it's a series about food in film. When I was doing some writing for a different project and I was reading around food a lot, thinking about food as kind of not just something that obviously we eat, but as like a cultural meaning of it. My way of understanding the world a lot comes through watching films, which is something I do a lot. So I just, through all that process, I found that whenever I was watching a film, I was thinking about how it represented food on screen. And then I thought it might be nice to kind of go back to some films that I knew quite well and that I liked a lot. And I could rewatch them and just focus on how they kind of used food and represented it. And once I started doing that, I just found it more interesting.
I mean, well, one of your first films is Jurassic Park, so how on earth does food come into that? Are we talking about human Lunchables now, or?
Yeah, I mean, the big food at the center of the Jurassic Park is the people have made this animal that threatens to eat them, right? I think the use of food in that is really interesting. Spielberg is a kind of a master filmmaker when it comes to weaving things together, so he puts a lot of meaning into how the food works in terms of humans being scared of becoming food as a big taboo. But he also doesn't let that interfere with just delivering a really solid action movie as well.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, in that case, we didn't move on to Charlie Chaplin. I mean, what's the connection there?
Well, Charlie Chaplin, his famous character was called the Little Tramp. So the film that I look at is Modern Times, which is kind of the last film that he made that was at all silent. It has some sound in, but no dialogue. And it was kind of his farewell to that character that he'd made really famous. And the thing that characterizes the Little Tramp is his poverty, right? It's the fact that he never has enough. He never has enough money or enough kind of places to go, or he can't find a job. And in Modern Times, the way that he shows that is often through food, by looking at how he can't quite get enough food. And so it's actually kind of a really interesting way to show the kind of political, social function of food in a society, really.
Fantastic. Now, you're also a filmmaker, writer. How do you manage to bridge your artistic vision between the two mediums of film and writing?
I think you just do whatever is most appropriate to the medium that you're working in. That just comes from practice and research, basically, and trying to learn the craft. I think for me, the way I approach it creatively, there's a lot of overlap between film and writing anyway, because you're storytelling or you're just trying to communicate ideas.
Speaking on your writing briefly, you also done some work with The Gap, where you had your book, Fountainwood. Tell us more about that project and how you managed to come up with such an interesting story in such was 20 minutes.
Well, no, actually, Fountainwood was a story that I wrote. It was commissioned by the Oslo Architecture Triennale, which is like an architecture festival in Norway. And they published a book of short fiction all about the futures, kind of utopian futures, because they were looking at a future beyond kind of capitalism, essentially. And so I kind of took that brief and I kind of changed it for my own ends and just wrote a story about cowboys, but on that theme. And then later on in the lockdown, The Gap, which is a really good Birmingham arts organisation, were doing this program where for 100 days they got people to record themselves reading 100 stories. So I read one of my favourite short stories, and also somebody else read that story that I'd written for this Oslo book.
Oslo, Coventry, Birmingham. Where will we find you next? Now, arguably your experience in filmmaking and academic background in film theory makes you a highly qualified critic. Now, what's something that you hope more critics bring to the industry in future?
I think each critic will have their own remit and their own process for how they approach films. I think what really strengthens any kind of film criticism that I read is a real good understanding of history. So that's not only the history of the context of when films were made or the periods that they're depicting, but also the history of how productions go. So what was the context that produced that specific film in terms of who was making it and how were they doing that? I think if you can bring that into your reading of a film, it just strengthens it that little bit more.
Makes sense. So that's Joel Blackledge, critic, filmmaker, writer, poet, pet dad. And you can find his essay series on Feast Your Eyes on his self-titled YouTube channel, Blackledge. And now over to Zara with our top 10 picks.